Hey ladies, so I wanted to answer a question on whether or not a pre-genetic screened or PGS embryo could be inaccurately diagnosed based on where the embryologist took the sampling from. As you can see here, I've already completely done a video. I recorded an answer and then realized that I wasn't recording properly, so we're gonna go again. So I wanted to wait until I could get to the lab just so you can see it. This is kind of the microscope where we do the biopsy on, if you're curious. Down there is a foot pedal that's connected to the laser. And if you see here, this is actually just a photo of an embryo, but that's the laser right there. Ooh, I just got green on the marker. That little red dot would be what we would position over here when we're going to be taking the biopsy. And I actually think I have a video of a biopsy on my Instagram feed from like a bajillion years ago. But anyway, so this is a little embryo. These cells on the outside, it's starting to hatch out of its shell. And so this is an embryo that was biopsied. It's ready to biopsy. The cells on the outside are called the trophectoderm. It becomes the placenta, and that is what we biopsy. This beautiful little glob in here is called the inner cell mass, or the ICM, and that's what actually winds up becoming the baby. So when we are biopsying, we cannot touch the inner cell mass. That's something really important to know, and if you realize that, that'll drive home the answer to your question. There was one study in bunny rabbits where they actually did biopsy different pieces of the inner cell mass, and they did not get the birth of a single bunny rabbit as a result. In fact, they only had one bunny that was born, and it had something called acephaly, which is without a head. It didn't actually have a head. So we can't touch this inner cell mass because that's what becomes the baby. We can't take a piece of the future baby off and send it into the lab. But what we can do is we can take pieces of this trophectoderm, which this is 2D, but it's actually like a sphere. It surrounds the inner cell mass in real life. And that's what becomes the placenta. These are the cells that are going to communicate with the maternal endometrial lining when we do an embryo transfer, and it burrows into the uterus of the female, and that's how we wind up getting a pregnancy. Anyway, so the embryologist will have to cut a small piece. Some genetic testing companies brag that they can diagnose an embryo in as little as a single cell. This is a cell, this is a cell, this is a cell, this is a cell. But usually we try to take off between, some between 3 to 5, some between 5 to 7 cells to make sure that we get a reading. So that leads us to a couple of problems. Problem number 1, there was a study in England, pretend that this is the actual embryo. There was a study in England in which they took 8, I think the number was 8 genetically diagnosed abnormal embryos, counseled the patients, and with the patient's permission, they transferred them. That resulted in the birth of 5 healthy babies. And then the other 3 women didn't carry the term. That raises some huge questions in the scientific community about how helpful, by the way, it's not called PGS anymore, it's now called PGT-A, pre-genetic testing for aneuploidy. So how helpful PGT-A is, and it really kind of challenges the notion that everybody should be doing it. So there are a couple of things we have to talk about, which would be, possible explanations for this study that happened in Europe. The first one is, I'm sorry, I already wrote all this out, but anyway, the first one is mosaicism, which basically is this kind of idea that embryos are not 100% identical from cell to cell, that it's kind of more like a mosaic. So maybe you have these pink cells here, maybe are genetically abnormal, aneuploid, but then all the other cells are completely normal. So maybe 5% of the embryo is bad or abnormal, 95% is great, and it can sustain a healthy pregnancy and lead to the live birth of a good baby. So what if just those small 5% of cells happen to be hatching, and then the embryologist biopsied them, put them in the tube, and they go to the genetics testing lab, and you wind up with an inaccurate diagnosis based on that? That's issue number 1. Issue number 2 is I put TE for trophectoderm, which is the cells that become a placenta, and I put ICM to abbreviate the inner cell mass, which is what winds up becoming the baby. So what if the trophectoderm cells, there's one idea that's what this arrow is here for, during the mitosis or, cell division and
replication,
what if the bad cells from the inner cell mass are actually spit out into the trophectoderm in order to protect the baby? So it's kind of a corrective mechanism that protects the baby at the expense of the trophectoderm. Well, as we explained earlier, we can't touch the ICM when we're taking a biopsy. We have to only biopsy the trophectoderm. And so what if, the cells that are going into the little tube that are getting sent to the genetics testing lab, they are abnormal? What if a lot of cells in the trophectoderm are abnormal, but what if the baby itself is good? Or on the flip side, if we go back to mosaicism, what if, only 5% of the embryo is normal, 95% is abnormal, and then, you send the cells to the lab and they tell you, okay, this is a normal embryo, you transfer it and the patient doesn't get pregnant or doesn't have a baby, then what? So it works kind of both ways. Like, these two questions that we have are possible explanations why PGT-A is not a perfect science. So at my work right now, I can't really show too much, but we have a research project actually in this folder, and we are re-biopsying embryos that patients have donated that are PGT-A. They are genetically diagnosed as aneuploid from one company. And what we have actually been doing with these is, so they're already done, they're already diagnosed as aneuploid. We've actually re-biopsied more of the trophectoderm, put them into tubes, and then two different companies have, or two different commercial platforms, let's say, have been re-diagnosing them. And then we took the entire embryo, put it in a tube, and two different companies, and they're blinded. They can't see what the first one said. They don't know what each other said, but they're retesting them. So we kind of have 5 different tests for the same embryo that was originally diagnosed as abnormal, because we want to see how accurate the science is. And we haven't actually published the results of the study yet, so I can't give too many details, but I can say that I have seen in the study one that we believe is a true mosaic, which is extremely interesting, but that doesn't actually help the patient at all. Because, for example, if the first company said this is an abnormal embryo, it's a trisomy, let's say trisomy 6, 12, and 16, and the other company said no, it's a trisomy 5, 17, and 12, either way, it's an abnormal embryo that's not going to result in the live birth of a healthy baby. So it doesn't really help the patient which number happens to be the chromosome that, is missing or is extra, as in this case. What will affect the patient, and this has happened in the study, is when, let's say, 2 of the companies say this is a normal embryo, and the first company, for example, said no, it's not. This happens, and it does happen, in real life. And it's not such a big deal for a patient who has 10 embryos and she only wants 2 kids and she gets pregnant after her first FET. But it really, really, really is a big deal for the patient that has no PGS normal embryos or PGT-A normal embryos to transfer, and then you're just stuck there scratching your head thinking, okay, what could possibly have happened if I hadn't tested them and I just put them back and just did, an FET? Maybe they would have resulted in a live birth of the baby. So the reason I wrote statistics here is because I have to emphasize that at least in our practice, when we run the data where I work, our PGT-A embryos or patients that do PGT-A, they have less transfers needed in order to achieve a live birth. So I'm going to kind of repeat that. It takes less tries at an FET cycle for our patients on average that do PGT-A in comparison with patients that don't, when they have embryos to transfer. The problem really becomes when a patient does not have PGT embryos to transfer, or if she only has 1 or 2 and they don't result in a live birth, then what do we do with the abnormal embryos? Where I work, the reproductive endocrinologist is uncomfortable, ethically speaking, on transferring, let's say this one was diagnosed as abnormal, you'd be uncomfortable, even if it's the most beautiful embryo, he'd be uncomfortable transferring it. I don't know how I feel about that either as an embryologist, but I do know that there are at least 1, if not 2 or 3 clinics in the country where that's what they specialize in. They actually specialize in performing FET cycles and transferring genetically diagnosed abnormal embryos. And I'm sure there's a ton of paperwork, and I'm sure it's really expensive, and I'm sure the patients have to sign a lot. But it's important that we know that that is an option for patients, that it is possible that you will have a genetically diagnosed abnormal embryo that in fact is normal, and it might even be as often as 20% of the time. So maybe you look just based on statistics, and you say, oh, 80% of the time when they call an embryo abnormal, it's abnormal. That's great. Yeah, that's great. But what about the 20% of the time that it might be normal, let's say, just as a general rule of thumb, and then that patient is stuck between a rock and a hard place? So I'm going to end the video here. I know I dumped a lot of information and it's going on really, really, really long, but I wanted to try to give a very thorough answer so that you know kind of all of what we're dealing with from the back end. And then, that way you have knowledge is power. You have the knowledge you need to be able to make the decisions that are right for you. So good luck, everybody. Hope this helped.